big subject that we've got here, the next two or three sessions about how TV wins, and I thought we would invite on stage one of the best analyst firms in the world to give you some hard data and give you some strategy tips of how they've seen it work in other markets around the world, utilising their data and their experiences. With that in mind, let's give a massive round of applause for Richard Broughton, who's going to tell all you broadcasters how you can win in this current climate. Richard, over to you. There's your clicker.
I agree. So good afternoon, everyone. Now, each year at this event, and I've been doing for about 10 years, the organisers seem to delight in setting an impossible task. So the first year I did this, it was modelling out the impact of what happened if Netflix introduced advertising, and this was a decade ago. The second year, it was what if an asteroid destroys the UK TV ad industry. But this year, I think we've got one of the toughest challenges yet, which is what a winning hand looks like for broadcasters. So why is this a tough issue? Well, let me set the scene with a few slides. These are all going to be a little bit doom and gloom, but I promise you it gets a little bit better. So the economy for broadcasters, commercially funded broadcasters, has really not been great. So the chart up here is looking at GDP per capita, adjusting it for inflation. So effectively trying to take into account the cost pressures that consumers face. And it's not a pretty picture. If we look at how this market has evolved, how Europe has evolved over the last 10 to 20 years, we can see that at the bottom in Spain, GDP per capita is still lower than it was inflation adjusted prior to the financial crisis. It's still lower in Italy. It's still lower in France and the UK. The only market where it's higher is Germany. And if we look at the last few years here, it does not very exciting. So if you're selling advertising or selling inventory in this business, it's tough. Consumers are feeling this. Advertisers, brands are feeling this. And it's hard to put your prices up. It's hard to get greater budget. We know that streaming viewing is continuing to erode linear viewing. The chart here is just illustrating, we run a survey, so this isn't audience panel data, but it gives you a good idea of the underlying patterns and trends. We run a survey every 6 months across Western Europe and other markets worldwide, and we're looking at the amount of time that people think they spend watching broadcast TV versus streaming services. And you can see the inexorable growth of that pink line there, and the decline of the blue line, broadcast TV. So the economy has been tough. Consumers are moving away from broadcast properties. And last but not least, tanks have been parked on your lawn. Some of the subscription streamers that have to date been taking viewers away, but maybe not advertisers, are finally beginning to roll out ad tiers. And this is US data, but it gives you an idea of some of the mainstream brands who are now working with the likes of Netflix and Disney. You've got Meta, Lego, Pepsi, Toyota, Walmart, Amazon, Volvo, Dr. Pepper, all big broadcast advertisers now working with the streamers. So there's going to be an increasing degree of pricing pressure in the ad market. So the picture for broadcasters is pretty lackluster. The TV broadcast ad market has declined. That's the picture. On the back of that, despite broadcaster investments in streaming services, in diversification into, let's say, the content and production market, income margins have been eroded. If we take the largest commercial groups in Europe, operating income margins are now averaging about 7%, down from closer to 20%. And that's resulted in market caps declining from about 38 billion for the 5 largest European commercial broadcast groups down to $12 billion over the past 8 years. So some really significant challenges. I said it would get better. So why is it getting better? Well, for one, the competitive landscape is changing a little. Streamers, one could argue, overextended, or perhaps are just focusing much more on profitability as a metric now. So if we think about one of the leading indicators where content is going or going to be debuting, we can see that the streamers have been making or ordering less content. So from a consumer perspective, you're less likely to find your favourite shows on streamers in the future. There's been about a 16% decline in the major streamers' film and TV orders between 2022 and 2024. And that's been particularly keenly felt in the high-end scripted market, so drama series, science fiction, etc. So there's a fairly significant decline in the sorts of volumes of TV shows and films that you're having to compete against as a broadcaster. And buried within this figure is also a change in the regional composition. There's much more focus on emerging growth markets, Asia, Latin America, than there used to be, fewer US shows. So from a competitive standpoint, you're probably not feeling this just yet, but you're beginning to feel probably a little bit of a lightening of competition from a content slate standpoint over the next year or so. Churn rates are up. The cost of living has had an impact on everyone, but it's also having an effect on how consumers are choosing to spend their disposable income. And if we take a look at this chart here, it's illustrating from a panel of about 500,000 internet users we've got in the UK. Churn rates have subtly ticked up. If we look at the black line in the center of this, back in 2021, the average churn rate for the major subscription streams in the UK was running at about 1.5%, a little bit under 2%. It's now ticked up above 2.5%. And that sounds small, but it has significant implications for these services. They have to replace more and more customers just to stay on an even keel. And there's an opportunity, of course, if you're an ad-supported free streamer, to tap into those consumers who still need something to watch. They've cancelled their service, and where do they go for entertainment? So with that in mind, we've seen a whole range of different broadcasters who've actually secured quite significant market share or market presence with their streaming services. So I've put up a selection on here. This obviously isn't all of the broadcasters in Europe that have done well, but just a few standout examples of where they're securing a significant proportion of internet users on a regular basis to watch their service. So you've got some of the Scandinavian groups, NRK, DRTV, Italian groups like RaiPlay, TF1 in France, BBC iPlayer, of course, from a non-commercial background, and so on. So somewhere in the region of half of internet users are using each of these services on a monthly basis. So what are the options open for broadcasters, and how can you turn the current situation to your advantage? Now, I could talk a little bit about some of the topics that have already been discussed today. So if we think about simplification of the ad buying experience or collaboration across the industry, but I feel those have already been dealt with very adeptly by the panels and conversations already. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the content dimension and how that drives users and usage and scale for these different platforms. So the first one is, if you're thinking about your streaming or your digital strategy, make sure your catalog is big enough to bring in audiences and keep them. Now, it sounds obvious, but you need content to attract people. If people have arrived at your service and find there's something to watch, they're more likely to come back next time. And we've seen a number of those leading services program their catalogs to an extent where they're comparable in scale to the leading subscription streamers in Europe. So you can see some of the examples RaiPlay will come on to in a minute. iPlayer, obviously from a non-commercial background, ITVX has done an amazing job at scaling up its catalog over the last few years so that it is competitive in the UK market in scale. And that has a clear advantage. If we look at a few of the southern European markets, so take Italy on the left-hand side up there, and Spain on the right-hand side, there's a correlation. The bigger your catalogue, the more monthly active users. So catalogue on the horizontal axis, on the vertical axis, the proportion of internet users who say they used the service in the last month. So there's a positive correlation. So make your service a little bit bigger, if you can. Don't just cater for averages, is the other point. So when you're thinking about what's in your service, think about who the audience is, and I suppose how they are coming to your catalogue and why they're coming to your catalogue. In a broadcast world, you, broadly speaking, have to program for consumers who have a limited set of choices. You can pick what's on the first channel, the second channel, the third channel, fourth channel, etc. And in those circumstances, you want to appeal to as many people as possible, and you want to make your content just a little bit better than the next person along. Now, in a streaming world, I think as Kate at ITV highlighted earlier, consumers have more or less infinite choice. So you now have to be thinking, why is my piece of content the piece of content that needs to be watched over everything that's on Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, and so on? And this is where even some of the broadcasters who've built up strong audience bases and strong catalogues, at least in volume terms, probably still need to do a little bit better, either at marketing or at targeting their content. So if we think about the UK market, and we think about discovery of content, And we remove some of the top tier shows, because broadcasters are fantastic at creating big entertainment shows, some of the very big drama series, sporting events. But if we focus on the rest of the offer, the sort of mid-tier, which is hugely important for driving consumption, retention, viewing hours, how much of that content is actively driving people to your service? So this basically represents the volume of titles where people are actually, we can see meaningful search activity for it. People are actually looking for those shows or films. And here we can see quite a significant difference. The subscription streamers, people are looking for those titles. That is not necessarily quite as true for the broadcasters. So there needs to be a little bit of thought put into who are we targeting with our titles and how do we make them stand out in a streaming world. We can look at that through a genre dimension as well. So the slightly complex chart here, just to simplify it a little bit. The length of the bar illustrates how narrow the commissioning strategy is for an individual service, how skewed it is towards a particular genre. So we can see groups like Channel 4, ITV, BBC, all have particular biases in terms of the pieces of content that they're creating. And that's, again, fine in a slightly more choice-constrained world. But if you're looking at a market in which consumers want to pick their favourite genre to watch, a slightly more diversified content offer is more likely to secure them to come to your service first. We also need to think about, in that context, long-term success and short-term reward. We've seen a focus on cost control across the industry. And to some extent, that might have benefits in the short term, but there are challenges stored up for 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And why am I saying this? Well, if we think about some of the commercial broadcasters in Europe and what they've done with their strategies over the last few years, they found it's difficult to compete in the current environment. You have to spend more on your scripted titles, your drama series, and so on, because there's higher production costs. Your budgets are being more constrained. And so you go for more entertainment shows, for documentaries, reality shows. And they potentially have good audiences in the short term, but in a streaming world, they may act slightly differently. So this just illustrates the volume or the mix of content that commercial broadcasters have produced or commissioned. 2019, about 20% of their shows were scripted. That's halved in 5 years. And that has implications if we think about long-term viability of catalogues, because the bulk of consumption for documentary, reality, sort of light entertainment, romance titles tend to occur in the, well, if we're blunt, the weeks after they're released. They don't have the same long-term staying power as some of the big scripted series. So scripted might be expensive, but it keeps your audiences in the long term. Now, you may be saying, well, hang on a minute, Richard, scripted is incredibly expensive. We can't afford all of this. The good news in that scenario is that increasingly the licensing environment is getting more permissive. So a few years ago, a lot of the studio streaming services launched. The studios thought, no, we're going to use our content, our service. It's not going elsewhere. We're beginning to see that relax a little bit. We're also beginning to see licensing strategies change a little bit. So if we take ITV as a quick example, the number of titles that are simultaneously available on other streaming services has gone up. And that's great, because if consumers don't have a subscription streaming service, the only place they can go to is the free service. So that's changing in terms of the way that you can license content, the way that content is becoming available. And that gives you more options than perhaps there were just a few years ago. Seems obvious, but in a world where the market is transitioning towards streaming, think about a streaming-first content release strategy. So if we're thinking about content that works in a streaming world in terms of targeting specific groups and appealing in a choice-rich world, we also need to think about release strategies that also work in that world. And again, we're seeing broadcasters begin to shift towards models that suit that. So if you're not already thinking about binge release strategies as a broadcast group, you should be. So this just illustrates, for a sample of about 2,500 titles we've been monitoring, how many were released on a weekly sort of episodic basis versus a full season release by UK broadcasters over the last 4 years or so. And we can see that general trend upwards, that more titles are being released in a bingeable way. And again, that's what people are expecting from streaming services in this day and age. So keep heading in that direction. And then last but not least, we've heard a little bit about this, I think, earlier from Channel 4, but think about wider distribution channels to market your brand. If we take I'm just going to pick ITV as an example here. I'm not singling out ITV. The same pattern would be true for any commercial broadcaster in Europe. But if we think about other competing or other peer group services, about half of Netflix viewers aren't regularly watching ITV's broadcast properties. About 54% of YouTube viewers in the UK aren't regularly watching broadcast, or about the same number aren't regularly watching ITVX. And about half of TikTok users aren't regularly engaging with ITVX. So there's a clear opportunity for users of those platforms to ensure that you're present on there to some degree, to ensure that your brand is recognized and they eventually migrate to your own service. And we can see the effects of that if we look at certain pieces of content that have debuted on streaming services. So if we take Cleaning Up as an example, originally I think on ITV, this just illustrates the chart position on Netflix in the UK. For about a month, it was in the top 10. And this is a show that was previously on broadcast TV. So it's indicating that there was a significant audience that hadn't come across it before, wasn't aware of it, or maybe just wanted to re-watch it. So there's clear opportunity for broadcast groups in ensuring that their brand, their shows are marketed on streaming services, so ultimately you can transition the audiences back to your own properties. So what does a winning hand look like for broadcasters? I think I'd reiterate again all of the comments that have come up today in the discussions. In your ad strategies, make sure it's simple. Make sure you're partnering, that you've got scale, that people don't have to go to 4 or 5 different groups within the complex CTV ecosystem to buy inventory. But also think about the biggest cost line item for your service and your products, which is, of course, content. So if we think about the options for broadcasters, we've just looked at half your addressable audience or half the audience on rival or peer group platforms may not be getting exposed to your content and your product on a regular basis. So how can you use that as a marketing channel? Obviously, Channel 4, with its partnership with YouTube, and we heard some of the growth stats earlier, is a good example of how that can work in practice. Balancing the short-term success with long-term reward. So how do you balance cheap but not very long-lived unscripted shows with expensive but very long-lived scripted series? Make sure your service is a destination in its own right. Make sure that people, when they turn on their TV, aren't just thinking of your product as an afterthought. They want to go there because they know there's going to be something they can find to watch to keep them entertained. Focus on content that works multi-channel. If it doesn't work on streaming services and it doesn't have a streaming release strategy, is it doing what it needs to do for your business from a strategic standpoint? Is it driving your business forward, or is it just about fulfilling current audience demand and advertiser demand? And last but not least, don't program for broadcast averages. We're in a world with near infinite choice. We need to be thinking about how consumers find content and why they choose to watch particular pieces of content, ultimately to make your service a success. So I hope that's useful. You're very welcome to download the presentation. And any questions, please feel free to grab me after the event.